My name is Bertie Books. I have brought you many things in my time, the least successful of which is a review of Michael Moorcock's novelisation of the great rock and roll Swindle. Let me start at the beginning. Find yourself a hippie author with no abiding interest in the band in question. Ahoy, ye scurvies! Thank you for joining me at Bert's Books, where this time we are going to be casting an eye back to the distant days of 1980, a time at which the musical world and the establishment beyond that had been shaken to their foundations by the recent phenomenon of the Sex Pistols, a band who themselves had proven not to be immune to the seismic and chaotic forces which they had unleashed. Nobody involved with the band seemed to have got away completely unscathed, least of all bass player Sid Vicious, although guitarist Steve Jones by this point was dicing with similar vices. The band's name still carried some weight, however, and manager Malcolm McLaren was not shy in exploiting this, somehow completing his long-delayed Pistols-themed film project, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, through these and other adversities, with Julien Temple in the director's seat in time for a 1980 release. Now, most of us will be aware of the film and its soundtrack and the hit singles associated with it, but relatively few people realise that The Great Rock and Roll Swindle was novelised by, of all people, Michael Moorcock. Michael Moorcock was an established writer with close links to the musical scene and the counterculture in general, which to a bystander might have looked like an ideal match. However, that's not taking into account punk rock's generational Year Zero edict. "Never trust a hippie" is one of the film's most often quoted lines, and Michael Moorcock could very much be described as such. Deeply involved with the festival and squat scenes, Moorcock was a prominent associate of space rock trailblazers Hawkwind, and his literary output up to that point had embraced both science fiction and full-tilt fantasy in the vein of the Elric saga. Now, with hindsight, we do have to treat some of these punk rock proclamations as engaging bits of hyperbole that don't always stand up to close inspection. Length of hair and width of trouser leg are not necessarily such a dividing factor as we once might have liked to believe. In reality, the Ladbroke Grove squat scene of the early 70s and the King's Road of 1976 were far more closely related than many would have liked to have admitted back then. Even so, given the preponderance of hungry young writers who emerged through the punk rock scene, Moorcock still seems an odd choice for this. Can he have made this unlikely proposition work? Moorcock chose to treat this narrative as a fragment of his ongoing Jerry Cornelius saga. Cornelius might be described as a pan-universal science fiction hipster secret agent, or an eternal champion, famously represented in film in 1973's The Final Programme, in which John Finch in the lead role comes across as some kind of cosmic prototype of Austin Powers. The film also stars Jenny Runneker, who went on to a prominent role in that other punk film, Derek Jarman's Jubilee. Like the film plot, the book is presented as a series of lessons, chapter 1 being on how to manufacture your group, in which it's evident that Moorcock has shaped the Irene Handel role, i.e. that of the matronly cinema usherette, as Jerry Cornelius's mum. However, we actually start close to the film's end, with Mrs. Cornelius lamenting the quality of the picture within a picture that's just been screened. She has a captive audience of Tadpole, otherwise known as Tadpole Tudor. It's quickly apparent that Moorcock has very little intention in following the structure of the film, as much structure as there is, but he's keen to imprint his own hallmark on this. There's still a core strand of Steve Jones in his gumshoe role of tracing Malcolm's footsteps and trying to pin down where the money's gone, but Moorcock stubbornly follows his own agenda here, certainly not Malcolm's. You'll recognise fragments of familiar situations within this short narrative, but the introduction of figures such as the Ukrainian anarchist Nestor Makhno isn't something you'd have banked on. Makhno is shooting the breeze with Sid Vicious, James Dean, Keith Moon and Brian Jones in the Café Hendrix, a watering hole for the romantic dead. I guess this to have been one of Moorcock's own particular flourishes. He certainly steers the plot off into his own meta-universe in which phantom Cossacks infiltrate a Queen concert at the Rainbow, and Motorhead's Lemmy crashes the storyline in order to impart some of his grizzly long-haired wisdom to a meandering Steve Jones. To be fair, I can picture that actually possibly happening in real life around this point. Anyway, the plot gets kind of sidelined off into this sci-fi like realm of musician assassins, flying boats, airships, a cryptic computer, time travel and vibra guns, all of which builds towards a very stylised version of the 1977 boat party, in which much of the embankment and parts of the city are destroyed by rockets, although the combined forces of Mike Oldfield, Rick Wakeman and ABBA are assembling at the Royal Festival Hall for a counter-strike. Ironically, I believe Sid did rather admire ABBA. Anyway, the plot sort of finds its way back into semi-familiar ground from there, with the pursuit of the elusive Malcolm, who only briefly shows his face towards the end, before a constellation of contemporaneous music biz faces and celebs assemble for the screening of the film within a film, and Sid's on-stage celluloid gunplay somehow breaks through the curtain into a real-world massacre of the assembled audience, and we're sort of left wondering what on earth we're supposed to make of all this, even more so than with the film. Now, Moorcock himself offers some explanation in the intro to this. When Virgin asked me to write a book to go with the film, I agreed after I'd watched the film, because it fitted in with one of my own obsessions. See, for instance, A Dead Singer, and because I'd always seen Irene Handel as Mrs. Cornelius. The third reason was that anarchy in the UK introduced a lot of people to the idea of anarchism, and presumably led at least a few to Kropotkin and other anarchist theories whose work is gaining increasing attention these days. For me, Nestor Makhno is the spirit of romantic, active anarchism, and although he might have been a trifle naive in some of his hopes, I have a considerable soft spot for him. He too died young of consumption, in poverty and some despair in Paris in 1936. This book is as much dedicated to his memory as it is to the memory of Sid Vicious and all those others who have, in one way or another, been destroyed by their own simple dreams. Moorcock has actually more recently elaborated on some of this on the Multiverse website. Maxim Jakubowski was the boss of Virgin Books in 1980 when, as a result of various complications, I was broke. What do you think of the Sex Pistols? Maxim asked me as he tossed aside the entropy tango he was rejecting. Not a lot, I said, made cynical by the recent argy-bargy. We'll pay you handsomely to do the book of the great rock and roll swindle in 10 days, to be published as a newspaper, to be given away in the theatres where it's playing. How handsomely? I asked. Very handsomely, he said, naming a figure. Rule Britannia, I said, and wrote a chapter a day over the next 10 days, while a lover stroke ex-lover alternately took overdoses or came at me with a kitchen knife, and watched the tape of the movie, which was not allowed to leave my hands, and pirates, getting wind of the event, sent me massive bribes to mislay the tapes for a couple of hours, delivering the chapters to the Virgin Courier, who turned up at 6 p.m. every evening for that day's work. But my main reason was to stand up a bit for Glenn Matlock, to tone down Malcolm's self-serving rhetoric, and to have Irene Handel play Mrs. Cornelius. Pistols had become more posture than punk by then, I think, though I have to say that they pulled themselves together later. I think Malcolm gave himself far more credit, so my tendency was to side with the Pistols version of events rather than his. This was semi-fiction, of course. I wasn't producing polemic, just riffing off the movie. I took the job from Virgin in order to have Irene Handel play Mrs. Cornelius. She died soon after. Great actress. She was also a keen science fiction fantasy reader. So I guess we might read this as Moorcock's deconstruction of Malcolm's rampant self-mythologising, and quite possibly there might have been an element of what do Malcolm and his upstarts think and teach a countercultural veteran such as Moorcock about anarchy. You have to applaud the originality of this and Moorcock's unwillingness to toe the line and to hack out a straight novelisation. But does it really work? There are fragments of lucidity and pearls of wisdom within this, but overall it seems like more of an oddity than really an essential item of Pistols associated paraphernalia. And while I'm glad the job never got handed to Parsons or Birchill, for instance, I can't buy that there wasn't somebody within the crop of punk rock writers at that time who couldn't have handled this competently. For me, this novel's central vice is its utter failure to capture the essence of Steve Jones, who is such a core presence in the rock and roll swindle. Jonesy's robustly charismatic performance, which is shot through with innate rough diamond charm, really is the film's saving grace, and it's something that Moorcock almost completely neglects to represent. The Jonesy of this book is an insubstantial, almost passive presence, and that, above Moorcock's various dabblings with the format, really is the book's chief failing.
I'm on a submarine mission.